Thank you, Mr. Freeman. And we actually raised a lot of issues. I mean, let me come to a more personal question now. And, some actually describe you as a strong opponent of the current policies of neocolonialism, right?
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes, absolutely.
What does that mean? And does whatever we have been describing so far feed into that new policy of neocolonialism?
Look at the history of Africa over approximately half a millennium, 500 years. You have slavery begins on the west coast by the Portuguese in 1420, 1440. Slavery continues for 400 years into the 1800s, where you're selling people as property. Then that shifts in the colonial period, where now you're not selling the people as property, you're using them as slaves and you're stealing the property in the ground, the resources. This is what Cecil Rhodes became famous for. He's quoted saying, kill the natives on the land so we can get the wealth under the ground. So colonialism starts to take over in the late 1800s, and then it's codified in the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And they divide up Africa. So you get the liberation wars start in 1960. Kwame Nkrumah sort of becomes the father of the liberation wars, the leading figure of them. And 30 countries are liberated in the 1860s and more later on. But what is the process? So from the 1400s to the 1900s, Africa is prevented from developing. It's called, actually, there's a book written called The Policy of Underdevelopment, intentional. And every colonial power that left, they did two things. The French and the British were the main ones, but the two things they always did was, one, no infrastructure. The only infrastructure was to get the resource to the port. So there's no trains running across countries, across the continent. Two, leave weak nation states. They did this in Nigeria under Lord Lugo when he amalgamated the various groups. To leave a weak nation state so there's not an identity of a nation. Then the economic policy, after the liberation wars, is the flares came down the colonial powers. But colonialism continued how? Through the manipulation of the financial system. The IMF and World Bank became tools, not of what Roosevelt, because he created them, Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. They perverted what he wanted, which was to develop, and they became the manipulative tools. And you had all kinds of policies, top down, forced upon countries. You want a loan? This is what you do. I don't know if you gentlemen are familiar with the 1985, the structural adjustment programs. They destroyed African countries. And it was admitted 10 years later they were a failure. But this is what they do. They devalued currencies. They stopped infrastructure programs. They removed subsidies. Nigeria today has never recovered from the saps of 1985 when they removed then the military leader, Buhari. Now he's the Democratic leader. They have not recovered Nigeria from this. So that's the force of neocolonialism. It does not focus on how to develop human beings. Everything that I do, everything I think about in terms of political economic policy, it starts from one standpoint. Human beings have the power of creative reason and the power of love of mankind, which the Greeks originally called agape. Those are only human qualities, which every human being has the potential for. Not all human beings exercise it. Therefore, the development of any human being is in the interest of the development of all human beings, and vice versa. How do we come up with policies that uplift people so that they can spend more of their time, leisure time, thinking, developing their minds, becoming scientists, becoming great musicians, becoming poets, and debating policy? What is a real democracy? It's not the election. You need election, sure, but that's not democracy. Democracy is to have a good debate or dialogue among educated people who will sit in an auditorium or a living room and say, well, I think this guy's doing a lousy job. Let's get rid of him. Well, but he's got a good policy here. Maybe. Well, what's your policy for the country? You're criticizing him. What do you got to say? You have a discussion. That's what our founding fathers thought the United States would be. Everything we did, we were a republic, not a democrat. We're a democratic republic. Democracy does not rule. We saw that in the last election with the electoral vote, because their view was that educated people could debate policy and come up with the best solution for the country. And they set up a Congress, they set up a Senate, etc. That's what we need, but you can't have democracy. If a woman is trying to figure out how to feed her baby the next day, she doesn't have time to think. She's not going to think. If you don't have electricity in the household where a child can pull out a book off the bookshelf and start reading, maybe Plato's Dialogues would be a good start. But he doesn't have electricity to read. He doesn't have his own room to read. He's going to bed hungry. Mothers and fathers fighting, figuring out how to feed and build their child in their home for the next day. You can't have a serious discussion because people pull down in desperate modes. Desperation is your enemy. If you have desperate people, you have a bad situation because they can be manipulated against you anytime. And that's what the regime change people will do. So our policy, my policy is always the same in general. How do we develop nations? And how do we give the policy to nations to develop the people? Because the people are the most precious thing on the earth, and they have the greatest power, and we have to unleash that. Now Africa has 400 million people living in poverty. They estimate in 10 years that of all the people in poverty in the world, which is usually Southeast Asia and Africa, 9 out of 10 will be living in Africa. How can you have democracy when you have so many people in poverty? You can't. So don't give us this baloney, as we say in the United States, about democracy when you don't give us electricity. If you give water to an African, he can produce food. Water is more important than most other things in Africa. Electricity, water, these are the things that people can use to build a standard of living on. And if you don't do that, then you're not serious, you're a phony. And I find a lot of what the West says about Africa and human rights and governance and democracy is insincere at best and duplicitous.
Maybe coming to one more instrument the West has to manipulate or prosecute the Africans, the ICC,
yes.
International Criminal Court. It is said that you are the outspoken critic of ICC.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that, and also if your concern is on the very existence of the court or whether it is like having unfair treatment of Africans in particular?
I opposed the court before they had the first African on trial because the concept I disagree with. You don't have an international court which you join by treaty. And some countries decide to join and some countries don't. In fact, the United States joined and then unjoined under George Bush, I believe, George W. Bush. You can't have a court based on people giving up their sovereign rights. If you have a criminal, the nation has to deal with that. And if it can't deal with it itself, then it should think about ways it can deal with its neighbors and other African nations. But again, the ICC was similar to my mind of another international organization that was going to take the legitimate issues, I mean a criminal is a legitimate issue, take it out of the hands of Africans and put it in the European Center. So this is like the IMF, this is like the World Bank. We're not going to let Africans, we're not going to treat them like they're sovereign. We're going to take it away from them and we're going to make the decision for them. Now, interesting enough, one of the key forces in developing the ICC was George Soros. He created an organization that influenced the UN in 1998 to begin the process of forming the ICC. Because George Soros is one of these oligarchs I was telling about, who thinks he should run policy, he knows what's best, he knows who the good leaders are, and he's not the only one. So the ICC was not, in my view, an attempt to solve the problem of criminal behavior. It was another attempt to weaken the nation states of Africa. And then, of course, I think 9 out of 10 of the trials were all Africans. But even before there was a single trial, I didn't like the idea.
Looking at the circumstance on the ground, which you pinpointed very well, the African circumstance now and the global order, do you think we will see the second USA in the near future, is the United States of Africa?
Well, it's going to take a lot of work to build up Africa to that level. But I will say this, it's clear to any thinker, even people who don't think good, Africa is the key to the 22nd century. It's the key. So either you have a good policy for Africa or you have a bad policy, but you're going to have a couple of billion people, the largest workforce, the largest number of youth, 1/4 of the world's population if all these projections are correct. And either we develop the people so they will buy products, but then countries will develop manufacturing centers, and the manufacturing centers then have to buy capital goods and machine tools, like you see at Boeing at the Ethiopian Airlines, place where we looked in a warehouse filled with machine tools. Machine tools are key to developing any economy. We don't have manufacturing centers in Africa. So if we can find enough intelligent leaders, China, Russia, India, US, Japan, we can find enough intelligence among us and goodwill, then Africa will develop in this century because it's going to be the most important concentration of people. So you're at the center of this century.
Yeah.
For good or for bad.
It's true.
My job is to make it for good.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. We could have pushed this conversation on, but time is not our best ally. So we'll be forced to stop our question here.
Also traveling back.
We will give you a chance to give any advice you have for probably the US government and the Ethiopian government as well, based on your rich experience on Africa and as well as your current observation in the conflict regions and the entire atmosphere in Ethiopia.
My experience over 30 years in Africa, just talking to Africans, not government people, is people really look up to the United States. I mean, even when the United States is treating them badly, they look up to the United States. They want to come to the United States. They want to have freedom like we have in the United States. The problem is the United States is not living up to its own. Correct. We're not living up to the founding principles of our founding fathers. We're letting ourselves down because we could be doing a lot more. Look, again, these are not difficult questions. The problem is mindset. The leadership of the United States and much of the West, but we'll stay with the United States for this discussion, does not understand or want to understand that the key to supporting Africa is development. So China is building railroads, dams, hospitals, roads, and connecting the continent in infrastructure. Not even close to adequate, but they're doing something. The United States says no. That is wrong. China is manipulating. China is pushing them to a debt trap. China is taking all their assets. By the way, not one African asset has ever been seized by China to date. And this is by Western institutions in Washington. But the United States says that. So why can't the United States do it? Why can't the United States support this policy of Transaqua to refurbish Lake Chad, which they do not? Why can't they build railroads, which they do not? Why can't they help build energy, which they do not? The problem is the thinking. My hope, and you got to be an optimist when you work in Africa, and also the United States, is that maybe we can get a policy into the President Biden that he would understand would be in the interest of the United States. Realistically, if you look at COVID, if you look at the economy, if you look at insecurity, violent extremism, there is a complete shared common interest between the United States and African countries. If we do not vaccinate Africa, we're going to get sick again. Even if we've been vaccinated once, you'll get sick with a new variation. If we do not build up Africa, we will see violent extremism continue. If we don't help assist nations in developing their people, then they will be overthrown and we'll be dealing with more dangerous situations. A hungry person is a dangerous person. A desperate person is a dangerous person to any country. And I'll leave you with a phrase I got from my Nigerian friend who I just visited a few weeks ago. He told me this in 1994 when I first came to Africa. He said, in Nigeria, the problem is the poor can't sleep at night because they live in poverty and they're hungry. And he said, and the rich can't sleep at night because the poor don't sleep at night. If you don't deal and solve the issues of simple, do I have electricity in my house? Do I have food in my house? Do I have a job that I can provide a welfare for my children? Do they have books they can read? Do they have light in their rooms? If we don't deal with these fundamental issues, you're not going to solve any of the problem. Some people think I'm crazy. Even though I'm now 70 years old in a few weeks, my mission, eliminate hunger and poverty in Africa in my lifetime.
Thank you, really.
Mr. Freeman, thank you for coming to our studio and to have this beautiful conversation with us, our audiences. That is all we have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned with the rest of Prime Media programs. Thank you.